to put back her hair, dropped 2 hairpins in the attempt, laughed, and sat down beside Yuba Bill with her hands crossed lightly on her lap. The judge recovered himself first, and essayed an extravagant compliment. "I'll trouble you for that thar hairpin," said Miggles, gravely. Half a dozen hands were eagerly stretched forward, the missing hairpin was restored to its fair owner, and Miggles, crossing the room, looked keenly in the face of the invalid. The solemn eyes looked back at hers with an expression we had never seen before. Life and intelligence seemed to struggle back into the rugged face. Miggles laughed again. It was a singularly eloquent laugh, and turned her black eyes and white teeth once more toward us. "This afflicted person is," hesitated the judge. "Jim," said Miggles. "Your father?" "No." "Brother?" "No." "Husband?" Miggles darted a quick, half-defiant glance at the 2 lady passengers, who I had noticed did not participate in the general masculine admiration of Miggles, and said gravely, "No, it's Jim." There was an awkward pause. The lady passengers moved closer to each other. The Washoe husband looked abstractedly at the fire, and the tall man apparently turned his eyes inward for self-support at this emergency. But Miggles' laugh, which was very infectious, broke the silence. "Come," she said briskly. "You must be hungry. Who'll bear a hand to help me get tea?" She had no lack of volunteers. In a few moments Yuba Bill was engaged like Caliban in bearing logs for this Miranda. The expressman was grinding coffee on the veranda. To myself the arduous duty of slicing bacon was assigned, and the judge lent each man his good-humored and voluble counsel. And when Miggles, assisted by the judge and our Hibernian deck passenger, set the table with all the available crockery, we had become quite joyous, in spite of the rain that beat against the windows, the wind that whirled down the chimney, the 2 ladies who whispered together in the corner, or the magpie who uttered a satirical and croaking commentary on their conversation from his perch above. In the now bright, blazing fire we could see that the walls were papered with illustrated journals, arranged with feminine taste and discrimination. The furniture was extemporized and adapted from candle boxes and packing cases, and covered with gay calico, or the skin of some animal. The armchair of the helpless Jim was an ingenious variation of a flour barrel. There was neatness, and even a taste for the picturesque, to be seen in the few details of the long, low room. The meal was a culinary success, but more it was a social triumph, chiefly, I think, owing to the rare tact of Miggles in guiding the conversation, asking all the questions herself, yet bearing throughout a frankness that rejected the idea of any concealment on her own part, so that we talked of ourselves, of our prospects, of the journey, of the weather, of each other, of everything but our host and hostess. It must be confessed that Miggles' conversation was never elegant, rarely grammatical, and that at times she employed expletives, the use of which had generally been yielded to our sex. But they were delivered with such a lighting up of teeth and eyes, and were usually followed by a laugh peculiar to Miggles, so frank and honest that it seemed to clear the moral atmosphere. Once during the meal we heard a noise like the rubbing of a heavy body against the outer walls of the house. This was shortly followed by a scratching and sniffling at the door. "That's Joaquin," said Miggles, in reply to our questioning glances. "Would you like to see him?" Before we could answer, she had opened the door, and disclosed a half-grown grizzly, who instantly raised himself on his haunches, with his forepaws hanging down in the popular attitude of mendicancy, and looked admiringly at Miggles, with a very singular resemblance in his manner to Yuba Bill. "That's my watchdog," said Miggles, in explanation. "Oh, he don't bite," she added, as the 2 lady passengers fluttered into a corner. "Does he, old Toppy?" The latter remark being addressed directly to the sagacious Joaquin. "I tell you what, boys," continued Miggles, after she had fed and closed the door on Ursa Minor, "you were in big luck that Joaquin wasn't hanging around when you dropped in tonight." "Where was he?" asked the judge. "With me," said Miggles. "Lord love you, he trots round with me nights like as if he was a man." We were silent for a few moments, and listened to the wind. Perhaps we all had the same picture before us, of Miggles walking through the rainy woods, with her savage guardian at her side. The judge, I remember, said something about Una and her lion. but Miggles received it as she did other compliments, with quiet gravity. Whether she was altogether unconscious of the admiration she excited, she could hardly have been oblivious of Yuba Bill's adoration, I know not, but her very frankness suggested a perfect sexual equality that was cruelly humiliating to the younger members of our party. The incident of the bear did not add anything in Miggles's favor to the opinions of those of her own sex who were present. In fact, the repast over, a chillness radiated from the two lady passengers that no pine boughs brought in by Yuba Bill and cast as a sacrifice upon the hearth could wholly overcome. Miggles felt it, and, suddenly declaring that it was time to turn in, offered to show the ladies to their bed in an adjoining room. "You boys will have to camp out here by the fire as well as you can," she added, "for there ain't but the one room." Our sex, by which, dear sir, I allude of course to the stronger portion of humanity, has been generally relieved from the imputation of curiosity or a fondness for gossip. Yet I am constrained to say that hardly had the door closed on Miggles than we crowded together, whispering, snickering, smiling, and exchanging suspicions, surmises, and 1,000 speculations in regard to our pretty hostess and her singular companion. I fear that we even hustled that imbecile paralytic, who sat like a voiceless Memnon in our midst, gazing with the serene indifference of the past in his passionate eyes upon our wordy counsels. In the midst of an exciting discussion the door opened again, and Miggles re-entered. But not, apparently, the same Miggles who a few hours before had flashed upon us. Her eyes were downcast, and as she hesitated for a moment on the threshold, with a blanket on her arm, she seemed to have left behind the frank fearlessness which had charmed us a moment before. Coming into the room, she drew a low stool beside the paralytic's chair, sat down, drew the blanket over her shoulders, and saying, "If it's all the same to you, boys, as we're rather crowded, I'll stop here tonight," took the invalid's withered hand in her own, and turned her eyes upon the dying fire. An instinctive feeling that this was only premonitory to more confidential relations, and perhaps some shame at our previous curiosity, kept us silent. The rain still beat upon the roof, wandering gusts of wind stirred the embers into momentary brightness, until, in a lull of the elements, Miggles suddenly lifted up her head, and throwing her hair over her shoulder, turned her face upon the group, and asked, "Is there any of you that knows me?" There was no reply. "Think again. I lived at Marysville in '53. Everybody knew me there, and everybody had the right to know me. I kept the Polka Saloon until I came to live with Jim. That's 6 years ago. Perhaps I've changed some." The absence of recognition may have disconcerted her. She turned her head to the fire again, and it was some seconds before she again spoke, and then more rapidly. "Well, you see, I thought some of you must have known me. There's no great harm done, anyway. What I was going to say was this. Jim here," she took his hand in both of hers as she spoke, "used to know me, if you didn't, and spent a heap of money upon me. I reckon he spent all he had. And one day, it's 6 years ago this winter, Jim came into my back room, sat down on my sofy, like as you see him in that chair, and never moved again without help. He was struck all of a heap, and never seemed to know what ailed him. The doctors came and said as how it was caused all along of his way of life, for Jim was mighty free and wild-like, and that he would never get better, and couldn't last long anyway. They advised me to send him to Frisco to the hospital, for he was no good to anyone, and would be a baby all his life. Perhaps it was something in Jim's eye. Perhaps it was that I never had a baby, but I said no. I was rich then, for I was popular with everybody. Gentlemen like yourself, sir, came to see me. And I sold out my business and bought this here place, because it was sort of out of the way of travel, you see, and I brought my baby here." With a woman's intuitive tact and poetry, she had, as she spoke, slowly shifted her position so as to bring the mute figure of the ruined man between her and her audience, hiding in the shadow behind it, as if she offered it as a tacit apology for her actions. Silent and expressionless, it yet spoke for her. Helpless, crushed, and smitten with the divine thunderbolt, it still stretched an invisible arm around her. Hidden in the darkness, but still holding his hand, she went on. "It was a long time before I could get the hang of things about here, for I was used to company and excitement. I couldn't get any woman to help me, and a man I dursn't trust.